All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Uh, it's a sunny day here in the Bronx, and today I wanted to uh, take a stab at what I would call an epistemology of podcasts and YouTube reaction slash conspiracy theory videos. And I want to marry what I know of academics and what I see rising in the community. And I want to really bridge those two because I believe that um, with, like, if I, I'm not saying obviously for anybody to do anything, but I think like with these certain like frameworks or ways of thinking about how to go about a discussion or a debate or even a dialogue would be kind of helpful in sort of like maximizing the the flow of communication and ideas, and also it should kind of uh, show you how to dance with an idea, uh, you yourself. You see, um, and I don't want to call it debate or like argument necessarily, because when you really learn how to dance with an idea, you don't really get into the point of a debate or an argument, because I would say the root of all of philosophizing or intellectualizing about a particular thing is that we know and learn about each other, even to the extent of our disagreements. And even if our disagreements are diametrically opposed, we understand that not only do we sort of like stand on that hill, but we also understand that other person, they're on their hill and they're standing on it, and it reaches a point where you can only really say respect. So I think probably one of the most beautiful and vicious things about academia is how raw and to the point and radical it is. And the reason I say it's also beautiful is because we're exchanging ideas which do have some type of weight to them, and I think the point is we are understanding, even if these philosophies are very opposed to our own ideas or whatever idea, that they will still remain to exist. That we're not really here for the sake of extermination. We're here to explore the sort of deepest or furthest or most radical reaches of somebody's observation, analysis, their ontology, their personal anecdote, whatever it may be. And there's no sort of um, searching for a type of annihilation, even if it's a meeting of two very incongruent um, ideas or philosophies, right? And that's why there's usually a type of mediator. Now, on the note of a mediator, I think that's something that would be generally um, beneficial to these like podcast roundtables, and that I don't really see a lot of. And I'm speaking like of like pop culture, but also like social theory type ones. Is and this is more applicable for the pop culture ones. It would be it would add a certain type of element if you were to add in, let's say, a quote, and let's say it, because so a huge sort of like social quandary I see just consistently recurring on these videos are questions surrounding masculinity and femininity, right? But I haven't really seen anybody like quote maybe like Descartes or Foucault, any sort of like philosophers that get at sort of like an existential study on sexuality itself, and it usually goes like right into the fire. So this celebrity and that celebrity, and because each of these celebrities are so loaded with their own histories and fandoms and things like that, you know, it those conversations do bring about a really great conversation about what our understandings are of gender and everything. Like how does it happen on an individual and a community type level? Um, but I think if we were to bring, maybe it's too nerdy, but I'm gonna advocate for the nerdy. To bring in some Foucault, to bring in these theories that kind of explore or try to define it. So that way, at least there's always a reference to go back to. And I think, if you were to kind of rewind a little bit, um, and to begin at that philosophical point, that way the discussion can just be on that raw primary level of, do you agree with this philosophy or not? And then that discussion could be had, and then it could motion towards, all right, now we're going to apply it to this celebrity. What do you think of celebrity A? What do you think of celebrity B? How do they stand? How does celebrity A stand according to this framework? How does celebrity B stand up to this framework? And then how do they interact at the end of it? Again, just to put in a very structured type of thing onto this. I'm very excited at the rise of these podcasts, these videos that give people's reactions or responses, these roundtable discussions that are happening, especially electronically. We are in a very exciting age of information. And so what this means is we're also in a very critical stage where it could be a lot of misinformation, disinformation. It was already difficult to filter through Google itself. Like even in academia, you couldn't really put Wikipedia on your works cited page because it's a conglomeration of various types of sources which themselves needs to be vetted. And so, again, I'm just putting this out there as a possible means of maybe, one day we could try it this way and just see what happens. The other thing that I just want to, because I call this an epistemology of like reaction and podcast type videos. And something I want to put in there is actually, what we're looking at is a type of knowledge production. Whenever I see these podcasts, I cannot help but think of like the whole knowledge production and also the whole peer review process within academia. That basically, even if we're talking about podcasts and roundtables on one hand, and then on the other hand, we're talking about like academia and institutions of higher education, both of them are essentially enacting the same process of getting towards the truth, and they also recognize that there are different types of sources that do matter in a discussion. So, for example, we all know that there is the ontological truth. So, in academia, we would say there is a type of ontological truth where that means like an individual's truth does matter in academia. That's the academic way of saying one person's history is actually not just vital, but it matters in the grand scope of things, because we also don't know how that person's life intersects with history, nor do we know how does that person's life actually create these types of changes which became history. So I'll give an example of there's a poetry book called Songs of Gold Mountain, but it's a book of poetry written by Chinese migrants in the 1940s in California during the gold rush. Sorry, 1840s gold rush. Now this is a really good example of ontology, because even though it's an individual person, even if they're not an academic source per se. They obviously lived it. They recorded their own history via poetry, and in a lot of those poems, you see a lot of themes on missing home, being exploited. They write about how they were told that if they moved from China to California, they would be able to keep the gold that they found when they came there. There was no gold, and also they were exploited for all of their labor. Essentially, they were the new permanent subclass within America by a series of lies. But that those individual counts, even if they're written in poetry and not academia, are academically valuable because they hold that ontological individual truth, right? So even though I said, the sort of surrounding historicity, context, academic voices, because an academic voice is someone who's been researching history and has come to a sort of like conclusion or one point conclusion based off of everything that they've read. So you're getting a very concentrated dose of knowledge with that. On the same hand, you also need just people who are living their life, but also the ones who are really trying to record what's going on with them, because one day historians going to look back and say what was going on in the Bronx in 2024, what were people doing, what was going on, like things like that. So an individual's voice does matter. And the reason I bring that up is because I see this in podcasts where they want to bring up a topic, and you might have one person who is using statistics and things like that, and that is good, but the other guests might be using more their own ontological experience. And what I'm saying is those are equally valid. And I'm thinking specifically of a one where there was I want to say a dialogue, but it turned more into an argument where the conversation was about men and women and who is wiser or smarter. And first of all, the guy actually kind of made a critical academic mistake, which was that he began with the statement, "I can speak for all men," right? And in that moment, we really have to, if we were looking through this through an academic framework, academic lens, and a very fine-toothed academic comb, that would definitely be a moment of pause with the really big, not just like red pen underline, but a red markered underline, because it's speaking in terms of absolutes. The idea that even men are themselves sort of like monolithic is contrarian towards even the actuality of just how like men generally tend to be like not just one thing. Like even if you were to take down like the whole like gay straight binary, it's just not as monolithic as maybe this person wanted to think. And my recommendation on a academic level would be to be very specific about what population. In this instance, it's actually better to be more specific than it is to be general. So if he was to say, well, I'm speaking about heterosexual men who are very attracted to women and operate based off of this type of whatever code, then we would have a more clear and presentable idea as to like what real population he's talking about. Academics actually try to stay away from very general type of statements because they're just easy to make. They're on one hand easy to argue against, but it's also not easy to argue against something that's insubstantive, something that just doesn't have any substance. And when you're in a position of an academic where you could be teaching like at least 60 students who each have their own research projects, and then you have your own research and things like that, where you are also in communication with your own peers, your own advisors, doing your own writing, you really want and need to filter out the general things which don't have any basis. And just like on a real level, like you get students who say very general things as like page fillers, like to be fine. And that could, it's not to say it's a bad paper, but it's also not the most strikingly unique or critically radical thing that needs to be unearthed. Academia is about unearthing particular truths and knowledges which are earth-shattering and earth-shaking, which are light on a particular past or history which has not been observed or perhaps has been ignored instead. So both academics and the community is interested in a type of not just a knowledge production, but an establishment of things that we know to be true, right? So, actually, I'll give this example, but if we take a look at the whole Kendrick and Drake type of situation, now this actually becomes like really dire against Drake. And I'll say I've never particularly been like either fan of them, although honestly, like as someone who is observant, who I consider myself a hip hop poet and a hip hop academic. I don't see myself as a separation of either of those, and that's why I'm actually trying to create this video to merge these two worlds. And so, as someone who's just like generally aware, and it's just obvious that Drake does co-opt every artist he's come across. He's not only co-opted their style, but you never hear about that artist anymore. Now I'm mostly thinking about what's his name? Party on the Weekend. There was a Caribbean artist that he was on the rise, and he had his own unique sound, and it was like the new sound of like Caribbean just beats, bro. And soon enough, he began to collaborate with Drake. And after this, you didn't hear about this guy. And he's an artist who did Not Nice, You're Not Nice, You're Rude. And it was shortly after working with him that you just didn't hear about that artist. And then Drake, shortly afterward, that's whenever he begins his whole weird, fake Caribbean, Jamaican bullshit, right? So it's clear to me that Drake, when we speak of Drake, is not necessarily a individual. He's a conglomerate of a team of different people. In no shade at all, but in very similar ways to Sade. Because when we say Sade, Sade is actually the band name, even if that's her name also. But Sade actually refers to the band name and the fact that it's a conglomeration of the band, the production team, the musical team, everything like that. The difference is Sade's not trying to steal other people's stuff. She's not trying to be in another person's style. She's always been herself and had her signature. And she's never been inauthentic in any kind of way. You know, in a way where Drake is. And in a way that's really aggressive. And he does it in a way where he does not credit those either. And it's like, Drake, you come from fucking Canada. Whoever you got that Jamaican accent from, you need to credit them. Right? Come on, bro. Like you're stepping into American territory. All right, maybe you can fool all those Canadians, but bro, here in America, we're gonna ask some questions. If we notice some things, we are gonna point it out. All right, and he just one big, goofy question mark. All right, now I got off on a little bit of track because actually the thing I want to focus on about Drake was his sort of historicity with what I'll say is like minor affinity, and that is the nomenclature that is used in modern days, and it just fits with his behaviors. Whether or not we know if he has or has not committed certain things, the fact that his text and his behaviors on stage, irrespective of knowing somebody's age, it just falls behaviorally, categorically into minor affinity. All right, so what going back to the original point of, in these discussions, it would be something different if these podcasts and roundtables would bring in certain definitions, certain sources, like, yeah, okay, well, according to Webster's dictionary, according to the what is it, DSMI, that psychological binder that has like everybody's potential type of diagnostics. That book, to bring in certain references, because for better or for worse, that's going to provide a type of clarity where you're going to say, all right, you know, and maybe that isn't done, because then it takes away from the actual like round table itself, because it's going to have to situate the conversation on a very different type of platform. It's not going to be, okay, well, are you for like Drake or Kendrick? It's going to be, oh, his behaviors actually do fall at minimum into minor affinity, right? Because then at that point the question becomes: is the public going to um, either support or condemn that type of behavior, which is going to reflect more on the people at that point. But again, that's my example of how and why we need to bring in like specific types of texts into the conversations. That way it gets rid of the opinion, and we know everybody's allowed to have the opinion, but it's going to come to a point of like critical mass, trying to figure out, well, out of all of this opinion, what is the thing that's actually sticking, right? And I think that when you orient it based off of certain texts, it's the fundamental thing that's gonna change the dynamic of the conversation. Although it's gonna be the same people and everything like that, but it just not just adds that spice, but it's a very deep type of situation where you're gonna have to think about it at a different angle, and that's the point of academia, is to intensify that discovery, to start at the fire, like really. So the other thing I really wanted to point out was, all right, so now getting more into like reaction, specifically conspiracy theory videos. All right, I've just seen a bunch of people really trying to reach in the creation and synthesis of a theory, right? And it can be horrible, and it could be, and it's not even the fact that that theory itself is inconsistent. It's that theory is inconsistent with another theory that person has suggested. So I'll give this example. Somebody who's saying that they're a flat earther, and I'll be clear, I'm not a flat earther. On one hand, they're saying, yes, we have like this, according to them, we have this flat earth and yada yada. But then later on, they're going to say that they have a theory about the expansion of the universe. These two realms of thought cannot coexist. Alright, if you're talking about an expanding universe, then you're automatically talking about a dynamic universe which is expanding at minimum. And in the world of physics, we can argue, is the universe expanding, is it contracting, is it fluctuating, whatever the case is. So if you're on the side of it's expanding, cool. We can establish that at minimum. But you're going to have to, at some point, reconcile a flat earth physically could not exist in context of the grander universe. Alright? And so that at least is an example of a major inconsistency I see within the reaction videos, within the conspiracy theory videos. And I know, alright, so this is where I do want to establish myself. I was a guest lecturer at Cornell, the School of Government. I've worked for different universities nationally since I was 15 years old. I'm 20 years old, and it wasn't until I was like 33 when COVID was happening that it just put everything on pause, and that's a whole long story. So, approximately 20 years working in universities nationally. I was a poetry judge for the Bronx Academy for Arts and Science. I was also a guest lecturer for the National Association and Academy for Chicana and Chicano Studies. I was a traveler within the Mellon Mays Fellows at Macalester College, which was very centered on like critical race theory, things like that. And so I'm just founding the sort of academic side that I'm coming from, and I'm seeing these conspiracy theories where, on one hand, yeah, they're entertaining. They're really, as a academic theorist, I love to theorize in general. I love the world of thoughts, of ideas, but some of the stuff that this conspiracy theory videos are presenting in terms of their theories is just it. As somebody who also vets and used to vet like PhD, master's, and bachelor's levels, capstones, thesis, and dissertations, really having to pay attention to like their logic, the flow of logic, the build of logic, rationale, things like that. This is really cringe. All right, and it needs to stop. All right, for one guy, I'm not gonna name names, but it sucks because he's cute and he can present the videos, and that's fine. But as soon as he opens his mouth, he says something that's like you could present the video, you could present a video of somebody maybe giving their deconstruction. There are some videos that they post where they are governmental officials, or they're reading off of something from the FOIA Act, Freedom of Information Act, right? So these are actual sources of information that can be used, which are like on the conspiratorial side. Now, going back to how I'm coming from academia and observing the conspiratorial videos, right? Now, this is why the reason why I understand is because of two things: the Tuskegee experiments and the school to prison pipelines, right? And so going to the Tuskegee experiments, and also the fact that I'm from the South originally, all right? I'm from Texas. It's not, and where I'm from in Texas is not too far from Louisiana, and specifically the area of Louisiana that has the KKK members. Like, you don't want to go out to, we call those the boonies. You don't go out to the boonies unless you're trying to die or disappear or showed up just dead, right? So that was very close to where, I was in Texas. And we're talking about like Tuskegee down south, not too far from even Louisiana or Texas. Like that is south. All right, that to me feels like its own brand of southern than even like North Carolina going to Florida. The whole west to east, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, all that's his own brand of southern flavor going on there. So we get wind of certain things. One of those things is going to be, the government could be experimenting on you. And these are things I heard as a kid. Now, fast forward to college, and then you learn about the Tuskegee experiment, and you're like, holy shit. The government actually did do this sort of medical experiment that I heard about. You see, and so in certain ways, the conspiratorial investigation has actually unearthed things that academia full well knew of and was on the production side of it, right? So that's the Tuskegee experiment. The other thing is the school to prison pipeline. So again, coming from Texas, coming from urban Texas, all right, Fort Worth. Fort Worth is connected to Dallas, and those are just two of the 5 biggest cities out in Texas, right? And when you grow up in the city like that, you go to these schools in the city, these public schools out in the city. In Fort Worth, it's north side, east side, west side, south side, southwest high school, whatever. You see this pattern of, where did all my friends go since elementary, right? And it's not the same population. It's gotten smaller. And yeah, of course we're going to grow up as kids and things like that, but it's a really big population shift. And you also see some of your friends going into the disciplinary route, or you just see other students going into that route. And then they're going to get a record, right? And so this is something I observed just as that student, as that person. as a person from that neighborhood, right? That was a reality that existed. But it wasn't until I got into college and I learned about the school to prison pipeline that really edified it. So here's another example. Here's something else I was observing in my neighborhood where it was nearly conspiratorial. You gotta watch out because you could find yourself in the juvenile system, and then from the juvenile system you're gonna get to the jails, and the jails to the prisons, right? But then you see, academia has been studying this for quite a while, and it just edifies what was once considered as conspiratorial in the neighborhood, but that which academia just full well knew and was like behind it, right? So again, I called myself like a hood academic before because those are me, right? And I've been involved in academia since I was like 15 years old, right? So a part of me has been in academia for the longest time, but you're never gonna take the north side out the boy. You could take the boy out the north side, but you cannot take the north side out the boy, is how we would say. And that's very true for me too. What that also means is like when I go home, yeah, I'm gonna talk to my cousin. I'm gonna want to share with them. These are the things I learned, and one of the things, yeah, I was like, there's this school to prison pipeline. This thing is known, it's studied, and it has a name to it, but nothing's been done. You know, because the assumption coming from the north side is, all right, well, if you had observed this since like the 70s, and I just graduated in like 2006, why wasn't nothing done about it? You see, so there's a huge disconnect between academia and the community itself. And again, what I'm trying to do is not just give the community the academic tools, ways of filtering or vetting certain informations or pieces of information in order to really get to that. So in a way, as an academic, I do go through those conspiracy videos and everything like that in order to, they're gonna go through my own filtering process, and a lot of it's bullshit, but some of it they bring up some stuff which is just like actually like you could find on the Freedom of Information Act, you know, and my problem though is with the theorizing themselves, and I actually want to provide some sort of not guidelines, but ways of understanding how when we're talking about knowledge production and we're talking about theorizing, we're talking about a very specific thing. All right, it's not something where you could just sit there and just blow clouds out my head. It has to come from a very specific place. It has to come from a specific lineage and tradition of thought. So not all. So I want to just throw out these words to show you that not all ideas are even the same, right? There's a posit, there's a postulate, there's a model, there's a theory, there is a hypothesis, right? We were speaking about epistemology and ontology earlier. There is also exegesis and eisegesis. So there's object reality, there's subjective reality, and subjective theory. You know, my point is, in the world of thoughts, it is very well structured. You don't just walk in there saying, I got this idea about this or this or this. No. A theory is only birthed through a lineage and a tradition of ideas that can be backed up by a recorded and true lineage of knowledge and history. All right? People and academia is very selective about who is that next person that doesn't just carry the torch, but that is the torch. You see, a lot of people would maybe on the admissions, I will say, well, you know, what distinguishes even within the Harvard pool or whatever, whenever you have all of these perfect SAT scores, it is that je ne sais quoi. All right, it is that element of genius. It is that representation of the next intellectual or creative or whatever genius that has to exist, because that's the only thing that's going to actually push it forward. And if you even if you look at Harvard, it's like half of it is actual talent and half of it is just like really privileged stakeholders. Like, to be real, why is it? Because I mean, the real talent needs that funding, and that funding needs its establishment to move forward. So it needs also actual geniuses to keep it moving forward and do genius shit, right? So that exists, and that's a reality of it. But the thing is, you're not going to be able to go into these spaces with just any type of idea, right? Because that idea is just an idea. It's not a conjecture. It's not a postulate. It's not even a theory at that point. It's just an idea. And it's something that really, at least as far as that one YouTuber, actually it's like 3 of them, to be honest. It's like, yeah, because I love these things, and there's like really gorgeous men who do these conspiracy theory videos. But once they speak, bro, once they speak, the academic heart of me just cringes. It cringes very just downwardly. All right, and so this is kind of, I'm gonna give just like a brief linear trajectory of like how is it that you could go from an idea to an actual theory, right? And before that, let's talk theory. Let's talk about what theory is, right? Because I think people say theory and they think it's just any sort of piece of information. So let's get into Pythagorean theory, because that is a very real theorem which is applicable to our dimensionality, our spatiality. We can use all kinds of geometry, not just geometry, but trigonometry, if we don't know certain angles, certain lengths, and only know certain angles between the two sides. You know, Pythagorean theorem has been advanced at least to that extent, to where we don't even necessarily need to know the sides. We just need to know the angles, and from that we can figure out sine, cosine, tangent, whatever the case is, in order to measure this side of a building, whatever the case is. Now, the reason it's called a theorem is because it's not necessarily applicable to, let's say, cosmological levels of dimensionality, and it's not even necessarily applicable to quantum levels of reality. Everything at that point is very curved. It's very orbital. If you think about the way a universe spirals, let's try to think about the spiral of the universe, and now let's try to apply Pythagorean theorem to that. So while Pythagorean theorem it's functional, it's true in our dimensionality, it also becomes very moot at a certain level, again, on cosmological but also quantum levels of reality, and that's why it's posited as a theory. Now, let's talk more into social theory, or maybe even like a humanities level type of theory, or even like critical race theory. All right? So critical race theory is not conspiracy theory, because critical race theory is actually based off of objective data. We can take a look at school populations. We can cross-tabulate that information with race, ethnicity, geography, class, and we can take a look at the historicity of progress, of success, and we can see certain trends to where we know that school to prison pipeline actually exists. It's there, right? So there is a difference between these two, because one is based off of actually a very objective reality, which is loaded with subjective realities too. But for the sake of like academia and people wanting to vouch for reality as objective reality is the only reality, we could see critical race theory is an objective reality, because even if we were to say, or take a look at the number of diaspora, the transatlantic slave trade, that's a very numerical reality and data that is pertinent to critical race theory as a whole. So it's based off of real data, real numbers, and real people. But conspiracy theories is almost not, at least as far as some of the ones that I've seen, that there are the YouTube video people who they might show a video and then they'll riff off and say these are my thoughts about it, and I think that's dangerous. It's dangerous because you have this platform, you have this audience, and that at minimum is at least misinformation, which is different from disinformation. Misinformation is just like, okay, this is just like me talking, and it maybe doesn't mean anything. It might mislead people. All right. The disinformation, though, is a very intentional misinformation. All right. That would be like whenever Trump was really supporting hydrochloroquine and telling people to drink bleach. That was disinformation. You couldn't say that was misinformation. That was disinformation. There was an intent behind it. So in these YouTube videos, you know, if you're going to start off with the theory, you have to actually begin with some sort of basis of reality, and it has to echo with that consistently. All right, and what you're doing is not necessarily positing anything necessarily new. You're shedding a particular light and angle and perspective and dimension on something that was already on in its own process of being unearthed or observed. Right? So in that way, you also got to be careful because you don't know who else has been researching this, who has been studying this. And academia is like beyond vigorous. It's very survivalistic, all right? There are some academic camps where you are just not going to survive if you actually do not have anything substantial to say. And you will be outcasted, and people are not going to give a fuck, and they're going to keep on moving about it. Alright? And that's the truth of that. So, in a way, these videos makers, when they're going off on their riffraff about this conspiracy theory outside of everything, it's embarrassing to themselves in a big way. Alright? So, the way it happens is you usually do a bunch of research. And you say, in my research, I have really focused on this set of academics. And it depends on the paper. It depends on the magnitude of power you're trying to enact, your reach, your audience. What are you really trying to do with your academic work? So you can say, well, I just want to do like this little paper. I'm going to research 10 people. But with that, I'm really going to postulate something, which is to say, I'm going to create something which is a combination of these different knowledge productions. Now, in knowledge production, a lot of it is, when I say compare and contrast, I'm saying, they're saying, well, person A says this, but is incompatible with person B. You see, so it's not even about, I think this and this. It's using these two operating frameworks. This is how they would interact, or if they agree or don't agree. So it's not even about the individual themselves. It's about essentializing both of these things and seeing how do they operate given a particular framework, given a particular situation, something like that. So you're first going to have to come with something which is an accumulation of various types of ideas. Now, from that, you could say, well, I have a posit, and a posit is basically, this is what I believe to be true. I believe it so much to be true that I'm going to pivot it as a basis for a line of 2, 3, 4, 5. Here are my next 4 or 5 points, right? So a posit, I hate to bring like Terrence Howard into it, but a positive his is just basically, again, I hate to say it, but it's a whole 1 times 1 does not equal 2 type thing, and I don't agree with that, and it's crazy I have to even point that out. But my point is, that's a posit. All right, because it's something that he believes, it's something that he's positioning out there to be a truth. And in academic, we call it a posit because it also gives us a distance. A posit is not necessarily true. It's just an idea that we're saying we will entertain this. All right, just for a little bit, we're gonna just entertain it. All right, because it means a lot to you. You really pushing it as something true. I'm not saying it's true. I'm not saying I agree with you. But for the sake of shits or giggles, more or less, for the sake of theorizing specifically, and I love to theorize on any kind of level, let me go ahead and take this posit and just see what if, right? Because usually, again, you're talking about a whole model of thought, a model of thought which has been constructed by various people, and then here you are saying, I have this one little hinge that I want to put in your machine, and I want to see how it runs. People are not going to want to do that because it's going to mess it up. Now, if it deserves to be messed up, it deserves to be messed up. But generally speaking, not everybody has that key. And because very rarely anybody has that key, that's actually the reason for academic guardianship. Right? A lot of people want to talk about gatekeeping like it's a bad thing. No, bro. Academia has something very valuable which should not be affected by that random person going on a rant on the subway. All right? That we don't want that. To that extent, speaking as an academic, power is not knowledge, absolutely. Knowledge is power, but power is not knowledge. And just because you have power doesn't mean you have knowledge, right? And I think that's kind of what this is about, the convergence of power with the actual processes of knowledge. That the world and the realm of knowledge is a very real world. It has structures. We might be thinking ideas are out here in the sky and everything. No. First of all, again, thinking of posits, postulates, theories, models, the very real structures of knowledge production exist, and they exist also in a structure, an object reality, which is the institution of the university, right? So on that note, during the time of COVID and Trump's presidency, there was a picture of Ivanka Trump. And she was dressed up like a scientist, had the lab gear, lab coat, the goggles. She had a pipette, and she had some beakers. And she's like pretending like she's actually pipetting these beakers. We know Ivanka Trump is not no fucking scientist. Alright? So out of that emerged this whole pseudo intellectual endeavor, this extremity of fake it till you make it. You can't do that in academia. You're gonna have to first study. You can't just say, all right, I got this video, and now I'm gonna just put my random conspiracy theory things out there. And then the danger is, now you have this audience. This audience believes you. It shapes their reality. And them being just individuals in this system will affect it. And because they are not knowledgeable, it's going to be detrimental for them in the long run. Alright? And that's the danger here. And the only solution is going to be something like this, where you understand, if you really want to be a leader in terms of the knowledge production, you have to go to the basics. You have to. Knowledge is a beautiful thing, but it's also dangerous when it's wrong. Alright? And we are in this stage of life where we have this incredible electronic communications and means of connecting to each other. And the other beautiful thing is there's so much knowledge sharing happening. I can't call it knowledge production, necessarily, especially like specifically for like the conspiracy theorists who's like theorizing on things like that. But there is a beautiful exchange of information, ontological and individual truths being confronted with certain community standards, community values, questions about how things are changing in our world, right? Now, usually what I see in like roundtable discussions, which I think are more on the social theory side, and that's wholly different from like conspiracy theories, because the social has to do with like the individual, and so the individual's truth, their ontological truth, is not something that can be disproven necessarily. It's their truth, right? And individuals comprise the community. Communities are made up of individuals, and so the thing is, I see a lot of like emotions getting in the middle of it for on both sides. On both sides, whether one is being explosive and direct, or the other is being more like passive and kind of catty. You have to just also recognize these are just two dynamics that need to happen. So in a lot of ways, this communication is a lot of energy that actually needs to come together and communicate, right? So that's what this is all about. But I think that whenever you think about bringing in, again, a text first, a solid philosophy first, I think that'll cool it off a little bit, because at least we're going to see on the base level philosophy where we stand before we get into the prime example, right? Because it's gonna change something. So even if you think of like gender dynamics, to bring in some like gender theory, like an actual gender theorist, what do they got to say? And then you bring in some other type of whoever it is, that, because people gossip and it don't really matter what the couple is or who the couple is. Then you bring in that couple, and then you relate them back to that theory, that quote, you know, because then that's gonna get rid of, this person saying, well, and it just straight up, in my opinion, right? There always has to be a justification to that opinion in a lot of ways. So, what I see is something very beautiful happening, and just as an Aquarius myself, it's just really exciting that you have this conglomeration of electronic media, community, communication, and knowledge coming together, right? It's very beautiful, but it also has a lot of potential for misinforming people, misguiding people. There are certain things that I see are being very overlooked, or maybe they're just not inserted or considered. But I again wanted to just marry the tough academic side with the tough street wisdom, streetwise, street smart side.